This is The Good Life. I'm Dean Wilson. You're not going to want to miss today's program. Sergeant Mike McGrew, 30 years in law enforcement, but his story is incredible. So wherever you are, stop and watch. You're going to be blessed. Enjoy it. The Good Life is next. This is The Good Life. I'm Dean Wilson. Thanks for joining us. I have a special guest today. Sergeant Mike McGrew is with me. The book is A Higher Call to Duty. It's a fantastic book. If you're watching right now and you or someone you love have dealt with pain related to your children, losing a child, if you've dealt with cancer in you or a loved one, Mike has been through a lot, and his story is powerful, so I'd encourage you to stay tuned. I actually want to read, if that's okay, I want to read the back of the book. Mike's a 30-year police veteran, and it says, Sergeant McGrew worked some of the city's most gruesome cases, from violent homicide of a suburban housewife to devastating molestations by priests at a local Catholic church. He experienced the chaos of the LA riots and negotiated with a killer on live radio. Still, nothing could prepare him for the suffering he'd encounter in his personal life, including the death of a child and his own battle with stage 3 colon cancer. Like so many other law enforcement officers and veterans, Mike began down a path of destruction filled with empty pleasures that the world had to offer. Just before reaching his breaking point, Mike found the hope he so desperately needed in an unlikely place, the gospel. A Higher Call to Duty details Mike's journey to redemption through Jesus Christ and how that relationship transformed him and propelled him into a very different fight between good and evil. So Mike's been through a lot. Mike, thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Dean.
Mike's a new friend, and when we met and I began to learn about your story, I just thought, gosh, it'd be wonderful for people out there. You know, the purpose here, and we were talking about this before we came on the air, is we're not talking about the good life in the worldly sense of no problems, stuff, build an empire, insulate yourself from difficulty. We're talking about real good life here. And I think that's something that you've experienced in reading this and getting to know you, that you've experienced a lot, you've suffered a lot, you've seen a lot, and yet you've come through with a hope and a joy and a peace that is incredible. Is that true?
It is. It is. I'm very grateful for my life. I'm very grateful to be in a place that I get to experience everything you just talked about right now. And most people look at the things that have happened to me and they wonder why I'm still standing. And I say it's because of God. It's what God did in my life and how He transformed me from a place of darkness and brokenness into a place that He showed me just the hope that He had for me and the destiny and just the plans that He had for me. And so I'm so grateful for that, to be where I am today.
Well, first of all, talk a little bit about your upbringing, where you grew up, and about your family.
I grew up here in Santa Barbara. I was out in Goleta, and my dad was, he retired as a fire chief here in Santa Barbara for the city of Santa Barbara. Most of my family, they were all public servants. They were from Los Angeles. They were all firefighters down there. My dad was a firefighter here. My uncles were mostly firefighters up here as well. And so I grew up not knowing the Lord. I had a good life. There was nothing that no trauma or anything that I experienced as a kid growing up. I went to Dos Pueblos High School. I had a great wrestling coach. Coach Hart was the coach back then, and he took a lot of kids that needed some help, I think, and he gave them some really internal tools to be able to deal with life in a really amazing way. So he got a lot of folks into college. I was one of them. During my high school years, I won the nationals in Greco-Roman wrestling, and I got a scholarship up to Cal Poly, and I wrestled up there. And it was up there that I had my own plans and things that I was going to do, but things took a turn when I was working on my truck one day, and the fan blade flew off on my truck as I was tuning it up, and it injured my hands pretty badly. So I lost my wrestling scholarship. I couldn't wrestle for the rest of the year, and that ended up started working in the trades. I was working in construction and going to school at night, and I thought about getting a job that I could work when it was raining. So basically, something that was steady. And so since my whole family was in public service, and I decided that I'd probably look at something like that. So so I started looking at the fire department, and somebody said, "Well, you ever think about being a cop?" And I never did. And about 6 months later, I was a cop. I was in the academy, and I was training for duty. So it was really interesting how I got into that. I wasn't one of these guys that always said I want to be a cop when I grew up. It was once I got that job, I found that there was nothing that I wanted to do more than that as a profession, because it was really a wonderful job.
So let's talk about that, being a police officer. And I think one of the things that I was thinking about today is that I didn't think about until I had lunch with you was the challenges of that job. So what police officers see, just what they visually see during, and especially the kind of work that you did. Talk about the challenges of that, and I got the sense at lunch from you that you didn't really necessarily recognize right away what you were bringing home, what was kind of sticking to you from what you see in some of these gruesome things, or some of these difficult, or some of the trauma that maybe is happening to a first responder or a police officer that they don't even necessarily identify. Talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Police work, first responder work, it's surrounded with trauma, and for somebody to go in and do that type of job and wade through, trauma that happens to them, trauma that happens to everybody else that they're dealing with, it's something that sticks to you, and you don't always recognize that it's having an effect on you right away, because when I came on the job about 33 years ago, the Vietnam vets were the senior officers, and I think they paid the price in post-traumatic stress injuries, because trauma is actually an injury. It's something that people experience, and it injures them. It's a brain injury. But as the Vietnam vets came out, there wasn't a whole lot to deal with, the combat and the things that they saw. And so a lot of the folks that I was working with, they just said, well, you're getting a paycheck, you got a retirement, just suck it up, and this is part of the job, just get tough and deal with it. And so that became the norm, is that you just sucked it up and you tried to deal with it the best that you could. But most people can't deal with that. And
right.
Matter of fact, I don't think that anybody can deal with that in a healthy way. And it took its toll on me, and it took its toll on a lot of people that I knew as well. So to go in and to do a job where you will see things, and I saw things that I couldn't even describe to another person. Some of it was so bad. You're dealing with the enemy. You're dealing with this darkness, very dark stuff that makes no sense. It's very gruesome, and there's no place really to talk about that. You can't come home. You can't talk to your spouse about it. You can't talk to anybody else except other cops, really.
And I want to get back to that, because that ties into the vision and some of the stuff that you're doing now. Mm-hmm. But let's talk about that season in your life. So you don't have God.
Right.
You are a police officer. You're seeing these things. You're experiencing what you're experiencing. You're taking it home. It's taking its toll. You're drinking more. Talk about that season of your life and what was happening.
Well, I was a cop. At first, I started off as a patrol officer, and I had a pretty rough beat. Back then, Santa Barbara was it was a pretty tough area. We had an area from State to Haley Street, or to Milpa Street, down on Haley Street, that was not what it is today, and it was before the 3 strikes laws. So there was a lot of shootings, there was a lot of stabbings, there was a lot of things that happened. It was an exciting beat. They arrested a lot of people, But at the time, crack cocaine was a big deal, and we had a lot of gangs from Los Angeles that would come up, and so we dealt a lot with some pretty bad folks. Because of my experience there, I got into the detective bureau pretty quickly, and I first started working burglary, and then I went into the major crimes unit, and I started to work homicides and armed robberies, sex crimes, child molest. It was, the worst of the worst of basically is what I was dealing with. But as I said, to deal with that type of situation, I felt like I was dealing with it just fine. I was strong enough. I was the tough guy. I was somebody who was there to deal with everybody else's problems and their issues. But I had no place to take the weight of everything, and I just carried it on my own shoulders, and there was no place to really lay that burden down. And so I just began to look for that comfort, and what happens, I think, to a lot of cops especially, is that there's an isolation that happens because you can't talk to your loved ones really about what's going on. Your neighbors don't understand it. Your friends who are not cops don't understand it, and so an isolation begins to happen. And you're out, working with cops, and you're not home a lot, working homicide. If you get a homicide, there'd be times where I was hardly home, months at a time, just because we were chasing down the bad guys. And so it just really started to take its toll. And to go and see the trauma of people who have experienced just some unbelievable, horrific crimes in their life, it always took a piece of my heart too. So you can't experience that and just think you're just some cold hearted person and that it doesn't affect you, because it does. And it always took a piece of you, and it just, a piece that you'd never get back. And so I started to search the things of the world for that comfort, and alcohol was one of them, and started to drink more, and that just makes matters worse. And you even check out even further than that. So
and that hurt your marriage.
Yeah, that did. I think a lot of things. Yeah, that it's just a culmination of everything that happened: the isolation, the searching for the comfort in the wrong places, and then before you know it, things start to fall apart. So here I was, the guy that was supposed to be keeping everything together for everybody else, but my own life was falling apart. And that's very common with first responders and people that deal with that kind of a job. That's why police work has a high suicide rate, has a high divorce rate, high alcoholism rate. These are the things that happen. These are the fallouts from post-traumatic stress injuries.
Wow.
And I had no idea it was happening to me. One day I was sitting in a class, and there was a combat veteran from Vietnam combat veteran, lieutenant, and he was talking about post-traumatic stress and the people that go through that, and the guy laid out my life right in front of my eyes.
Right?
Yeah, and I was going, wow, that's me.
Wow.
Yeah, so but there was still no place really for me to lay it down. I said, well, that's interesting, but what do I do with all this?
Yeah.
How do I carry this?
So you are going out on a first date, I believe, and it was going to be to a concert at the Santa Barbara Bowl. Chris Tomlin, is that right?
Yeah. So yeah,
Fast
if you think,
forward
you can fast forward to that.
Or get there. Go ahead.
To get there, so what happened is through the police career, there was a lot of damage that happened, to me and to my family as well, because it doesn't just happen to you; it happens to your family as well. And so my youngest son, Michael Thomas McGrew, and we call him TT. That's he had a different middle name than me, so we called him TT. He was 12 years old, and he got diagnosed with bone cancer, and that was another big hit for me, because here I was still out there taking care of everybody else, and on the front, I went out and did my job. I was a hard worker, and we'd catch the criminals and do what we needed to do, but on the inside, things were starting to unravel. And then when my son got diagnosed with bone cancer at 12 years old, that was something that I didn't even know what to do. I didn't know where to turn, because now I had something that I had no control over. I was used to being in control, and now I had none. And I didn't know what to do. and it was the most precious thing, my child who was hurting now and suffering. And so it even took me, I think, to a deeper place of just darkness as well. At that point, a lot of people began to talk to me about faith and about God, and I didn't want to hear it at that time, because I would say, well, if there's a God, then why does my 12-year-old have cancer? Why is he missing his leg? He had to have his leg amputated, and we spent about 200 days a year in the hospital doing chemo, and the chemo almost killed him several times just from the side effects of that. And then at the same time that was happening, then my older son got involved in drugs and picked up a drug addiction. And so there was a couple different fronts that I was fighting, and things began to unravel, and I lost a second marriage at about the same time. So I was in a place where I think the only place I could look was up, because I had no answers. Everything was falling apart. And I met my current wife, Nicole, and it was our first date, and she said, let's go to this concert. It was a Chris Tomlin concert. And we went to the County Bowl, and I had no idea what I was getting into. I just wanted to go out with a pretty girl. So I was sitting in that concert, and the pastor, Louis Giglio, came out, and he spoke. And he had a message, and I felt like that message was right for me. And it was, he just said, is there anybody in that audience, and there was 5,000 people there that night, whose life feels out of control, who, the chaos is just overwhelming them, who needs peace, who, he began to talk about what Jesus had to offer. And I sat there, and I couldn't believe that this guy knew my life story as he spoke. It was just that supernatural, and the Holy Spirit just hit me. And so I looked around, and I was thinking, how does this guy know my story? So it was the next day that I went and I talked to my cousin, Dan McGrew, and he had been raised a little different. His dad, who was my dad's brother, raised him as a Christian, raised him to know the Lord. And they had been praying for me, the whole time, as I was going through everything, all the trials that I'd gone through. And I asked Dan, I said, would you tell me about Jesus? And Dan said, yes, I've been waiting for this moment. And so he did. And so we talked about Jesus, and it was at that moment that I gave my life to Christ. And it started that mustard seed size of faith that just began to grow and grow and grow and grow. Wow. And the transformation started to happen from that point for me. And then I realized that, God was very present. I saw him in my life, and I look back, and I have to say that no matter, all the bad things that I'd seen at the police department and all the things that I had experienced, even as a non-believer, I always saw something powerful, and it was the thing that kept me coming back. So it could be the strength of a victim, who had suffered something horrible, who was able to come back and just regain their life, or it could be the community coming around, somebody who was struggling or coming together through some kind of disaster or whatever it might be. There was always something powerful, and I remember saying, that's why I'm doing this. That's why I'm coming back, each time. And when I became a sergeant of the Major Crimes Unit, I made sure that the detectives that were working for me, I said, watch for it, because it's there, and this is, so look for it. And I also, I had a different view when I was supervising that unit, because I really cared about the people that worked for me. I didn't want them to have to go through the things that I went through.
Yeah.
So it was there, but I realize now, and after I came to the Lord, that it was God's grace. God's grace was always there. It's just now I began to see it for what it was. And he was always with me, and he was always walking with me. He was walking with me the entire time.
Yeah.
And I was never alone.
So you when you met the Lord with your cousin, right, after the concert, but you're still in a situation where you have a 12-year-old son with cancer.
Right.
You have another son who's struggling. Your marriage was ended. And so your circumstances certainly didn't change overnight, but that
Right.
but that was the first day of kind of a new life for you. It
was.
sounds like. Is that kind of what you experienced? Okay,
It-
that was
yeah,
kind of the line in the sand.
Yeah, things began to change, and then I realized that I had a God that I could have a relationship with, because for me it was religion always kept me away from God. That really it was. People would talk about religion, and I'm like, I don't want any part of that,
Yeah.
But I finally had a place in a relationship, and I would pray and I would ask God for things in my life, and they were selfish prayers at the start, but soon I realized that it wasn't about me. It was about serving God. And I saw that the service I was in as a cop was not just being a cop anymore. The calls that I began to go to were there to help people out with the testimony of the things that I was going through. So I was able to share the things that I've experienced as a man and as a father to the people that I would go to their homes with. And so I began to pray a lot about in 1 Corinthians 14 talks about the gift of prophecy, which is there to edify the Lord and exhort the Lord and the church and to comfort man. And I'm just like, that's what I want to do. I want to build up the church. I want to edify God. I want to comfort man, because that's what God
As
was
a police officer.
As a police officer.
Yeah, because if a police officer walks up to me, it's not that great of an experience.
Right.
No. You have that uniform on. So you walk up to somebody. It's not like you're bringing good news.
Right.
But you started to see that role as an opportunity for you to minister.
Right, and I did, and it wasn't always just being there evangelizing while I was out on a call, but it would be there to offer, some sense of hope just with my own experience. Because when we speak from I statements, people will listen to that.
Right.
They'll say, "Hey, what, how would you get through this?" When you share your heart and open your own life up to them, they want to hear that. They want to hear, how do you deal with a kid with a drug addiction?
Right.
Because I would be there and I would tell them, "Hey, I'd talk to another parent and I'd say, you know what, my son's going through a gnarly drug addiction right now," and they'd go, "Wow, how are you dealing with this?" And
Right.
I'd be able to offer some help in that area.
And I want to get to that in depth. I just want to stop for a second for people. So you come to God. You just came to God, not a religion. You came to God, and you've got all these things happening in your life. Talk about, and maybe there's somebody out there watching who just comes to God and says, here I am. And what did it look like for you, just in your practical daily life? Did you just start talking to him?
I did. I just started to pray. And
What would you say?
One of the things that I started, and I still do to this day, is I would pray for more faith, because there was things I didn't understand. There were things that, God's a supernatural God, and there's things that His ways are not our ways, and so there were things that I needed to understand more, but I needed to have that faith. And so faith is a gift, and I would ask God for that faith. I would say, "God, please give me more faith." And God answers those prayers. He loves those prayers. And so that faith would come, and
you built on
that. And it just kept growing and growing and growing, and I would see Him in more situations always. As the more I began to even pray for the gift. At first, when I prayed for the gift of prophecy, I felt like it was just to comfort people, but then I began to hear Him and see His voice in the Word, and circumstances, and witnesses, and just as He began to speak, in my life. And so it just really began to fill things for me.
And one of the things that I thought about after we had lunch, so you talk about some of the behaviors. You weren't, I don't think people decide to wake up in the morning and drink too much. Gee, today I think I want to drink too much. That sounds like a great idea. Or I think I want to really explore some new destructive habits. People are filling, numbing, dealing. Right. They're not. It's not like they're craving the desire to destroy relationships.
Right.
They're trying to deal with.
Yeah.
So when you came to God, did you find that the stuff that you were doing just kind of fell off?
Yeah,
because
what happened for
what
me
happened?
is I'd taken my son to a couple rehabs, and I was just like, hey, let's get him fixed, let's put him in a rehab, and it's not that simple. That's not the way it works. You want it to work that way and think everything's going to be okay, but that's not the way addictions work at all. But I started to evaluate, my own behavior, and what was I teaching my son? I was teaching him to deal with things by not dealing with them, by drinking, And now that I had God, I had a place to take my burdens and to really just say, Lord, this is heavy on my heart. Help me with this. Help me with this situation. And those were my prayers. And to not have alcohol in my life, and if the craving hit, to know what that was. That was the enemy, because that's the enemy. The enemy he's behind all that stuff.
Yeah.
And he wants to distract you any way he can away from God.
Yeah.
And the more I open my heart up to the Lord, then, it's I've been sober since.
Yeah.
And it was that decision. It wasn't, for me, it wasn't going through a program or anything. It was just opening my heart up to God and just saying, what, I want to.
And you're free of it.
Yeah, and I was free of it.
So, somewhere along the line, you get diagnosed with cancer.
I did.
When was that in the process of all this?
Well, it should back up again. I think, about halfway through my son's journey is when I came to the Lord. And he ended up dying when he was 18 years old. And I saw how God was so gentle with me. And he didn't die of the cancer. What had happened was he ended up committing suicide. The cancer came back 3 times. And he had been through a lot. And when he was 18 years old, he took all of his. He wrote a note. And he took his pain meds, and he ended up committing suicide. But in the note there was something. He said, "I love you all. It's nobody's fault." And I found the note 3 years later. It was in my desk. I don't know why I had it at work, but there's something inside me I just can't explain. And to me, I felt like that's the enemy. Those were the lies that the enemy was whispering in his ears. But I saw. That day, after his mom, so my first wife, found him, I went to the house, and there was a sea of blue. There was a bunch of cops that were there, and it was here in the city, and God had brought so much comfort and just all the right people to be there that day and to walk me through everything that I needed for that very moment. And Chuck Reed, one of the pastors, one of the chaplains there, he was there, and he came in, and they asked, "Do you want a chaplain?" And I did, and I asked for Chuck, and I didn't know it, but his son was diagnosed with cancer too, and his son had taken a turn for the worse. And had I known that, I wouldn't have asked for Chuck. I wouldn't have had him come there, but I did. And Chuck came, and he said a prayer that day that just brought in everything that I needed. It was the Holy Spirit used him in a really amazing way. But I also, he and I both know this as we talk, that God was preparing him to lose his child too, because he watched. And at that moment, I was leveled. There was nothing I could do. I'd never suffered a hit that bad, and I could only rely on God for his strength. And so I did, and I was able to give my son's eulogy. I was able to walk through that, the worst tragedy of my life, losing a child, and know that God was with me, and know that my son was with God too, because he showed me some supernatural things that my son was in heaven, with him. So I took about a month off afterwards, and I told God, before I came back to work, I said, I don't want to go to another dead child call. I don't want to tell another family member that that they lost a loved one. I'm out. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that anymore. And that's all the calls I got, one after another. Those were all the calls because I was working patrol at the time, and those were all the calls I kept going to. And I quickly realized that and I was like, what are you doing, God? And I quickly realized that he had me on those doorsteps for those families for a reason. And it was that, my heart was broken wide open, and that they could look inside. And for that moment, at that very time, he was using me to help lift them up. And they would say, how did you survive this? Because I would share what I had been through.
Wow.
And I could only point up, and I could only point to God. So it became very, very powerful what God was doing, just with the loss of my own child and other people's lives, and just the people that he brought me around. Just as we fellowship and go through that kind of trial with other people, there's bonds that happen. It's really amazing. So I was grateful for the fact that God. It wasn't just my son just died and it was over, and it was just like, no, a lot of things were happening. So we, I started to really see that every call that I was on was a divine appointment. I became a motor cop after a while. I'd pull cars over, and I was a sergeant. I didn't have to write a lot of tickets, but I supervised the guys who did, and I'd pull people over, and they'd start to cry, or something would happen, and I'd just be like, okay, well, what's going? It's not about the ticket.
I've cried with police officers.
Yeah, but usually it's not about the ticket. And I'd go, what's going on? And they'd tell me, hey, I just got back from the doctors. I just found out I have cancer or something. And so I'd ask them about their faith and if they had a place to go. And usually the story was that they did have a faith at one time, but they had walked away from God, and then they were here. And so I'd ask them if I could pray with them, if they wanted a prayer, and they would always say yes. I don't know if they were trying to get out of the ticket or not.
Right.
But they would always say yes.
Give them the benefit of the doubt.
But no, it was it would always be a special time, and they would want to prayer, and I God would just give the words, for that prayer, and then I just say, if you don't think God's not with you, then ask yourself why a motorcycle cop's praying with you at the side of the road,
Right.
And they
Right.
go, yeah, you're right.
Wow.
So yeah, then later on, I got diagnosed with cancer, and for me that wasn't, I knew God had it. It was something that I knew. There were so many people praying for me, and I knew that he had that situation, and it was never scary for me. To go through it yourself doesn't even compare to having a child go through it, but it was something that I again had a place to just take any of my worries, anything that I felt was burden, and most of the times it's you worry about those people around you,
right?
And so I was cancer free for 4 years, and I did. Matter of fact, about 4 weeks ago, I got re-diagnosed. The cancer came back, and they removed it. I went through a surgery, and the doctors have they said that they aren't sure what to do with it. It was colon cancer. So they maybe want to put me in some experimental thing. They don't know what to do with it, but I feel like I have this peace, and God's been opening doors ever since the re-diagnosis. They've been these amazing doors, even this show and being on this show and the opportunity to share. I've been more energized than ever, and I know that every day is a gift. I knew that as a cop. Because, even in the bad times, I always told my kids or my loved ones that I loved them before I got off the phone, because I saw that a lot of people didn't go home. A lot of people didn't make it home after a traffic accident or after a shooting or whatever it might be. But I really know how precious life is, and that we have to make it precious. And so I feel like I've been... I was talking to my best friend. He played for USC, and he had a coach, Pat Hayden, who said, "Sprint to the finish." And I really feel like that. Mm-hmm. Not that I'm, I've been given any kind of terminal, diagnosis, but it's even given me more energy to do what it is that God wants me to do, because these doors are opening up, and and there's so many opportunities to go out and to help people, and to share our testimonies. We all have a testimony. They're all powerful. I have one. I've had a lot of things happen to me in one life. That's why we put it on this book. I gave my testimony one year at the prayer breakfast, and a group of people came together and said, you need to write a book. Yeah. And I said, no, I don't. I don't. And the next thing I prayed about it and said, okay, I'll write the book. And that's when I got diagnosed with the cancer that time. And so I was sitting in the hospital after they did a big surgery, and Sarah Bush ended up becoming the writer after that, and just through a lot of divine things that had happened. And this book has been used to touch a lot of people because I prayed about it, and each time we met, we prayed that my what God's done in my life, and just my testimony would help somebody else. It would help somebody that's been through trauma, somebody that's been through the loss, grieving, somebody that's been through addiction, or a loved one with addiction, or loss in their life. Whatever it might be, because I've experienced that all. But I have to say that that I know that God strengthened me through all that. And I feel like I'm grateful for my journey.
If you're just joining us, my guest is Sergeant Mike McGrew. The book is A Higher Call to Duty. I commend it to you. Let's talk about your other son for a minute. And I think a lot of people deal with addiction, and it touches, I think, every family. And it's very difficult, and it can be confusing, and it can feel repetitious, and it can feel like, is this ever going to change? And I was reading this last night, and I read a story about one time you were, I think, on patrol when you saw your son on the street. And you left him there.
Yeah.
Tell me about that, and what was that like, and how did that? When I read it, it seemed to me that was a time when you trusted God, and you didn't try to save him that time. Yeah. Talk about that, and talk about your son.
Well, I think that to have a loved one that's in addiction that's I likened it to the cancer journey, almost, with my other child, because it was something that you can't control, that happens, and you want to do something, you think you have the answers, and there's just a lot of struggles that happen in that journey. And I know that at the start, when my son was at first there was denial. I'm thinking, how could my kid be involved in drugs like this? But when I realized that it was a problem, that it was an issue, I felt like, there's programs. Let's just get him into this program. He's going to be sober. Everything's going to be fine. Yeah, let's just fix this. And that wasn't the case. Addiction is just it's a horrible thing, and it just kept happening over and over. And before I knew it, we were in the third, the fourth, the fifth drug rehab. He couldn't stay sober for over 90 days, and it just kept going over and over. And I'd spent so much time trying to maybe clean up his messes or fix his problems, and as he would fall, as a parent, you want to put that pillow out there so that they don't fall and hit the ground that hard. But you soon have to realize that they need to have that fall, and it's not the tough, I don't know if it's tough love or not, if you want to call it that, but it I realized that my life was connected to his ups and downs, and that when things were good for him, things were good for me. When things were bad and he was in his addiction, then my life was suffering. And so what I was able to do, and God, and I could only have done it. For me, it was God. I had to trust the Lord with my son, and no matter how bad Matt got, and he was at a place where he was in a horrible addiction. He was homeless. He was living on the streets. I didn't know if he was going to be alive or not the next day. And I was riding a motor and I remember it was a sunset one day, and I just got off my bike. TT had already died, and I just told the Lord, I said, you know, I got to trust you with my son. I got to trust you fully with my son, because I know that you love him more than I do. And it was that moment when I gave him up. It was even like the Abraham Isaac moment where I said, I give you my son. You know, that God really spoke into me, and he gave me peace and he gave me strength, you know, because now I wasn't trying to control that situation. I was trusting God with that situation. So a couple days later, I saw him out on the streets, and he wasn't looking good, and he, you know, I pulled over, and he was sitting on a curb, and he said, Dad, can you just, you know, take me home, or, you know, can you just feed me tonight, or, you know, house me tonight? And, you know, I told him, I said, if I feed you or clothe you or house you tonight, you know, you're not going to do what you need to do. You know, so I said, I can't, buddy, I can't. And I wouldn't have had that strength if I didn't trust God with the situation, but I was trusting the Lord. And it was about a couple days later that he got into a program himself. It was the first time he ever got into a program himself. It was always before it was me trying to get him into that program. So I watched how that worked once I stepped out of the way in that. And so I learned from that moment on that, you know, no matter how bad the situation was, that, you know, my life didn't have to be just completely destroyed because of his addiction. You know, I could sit back and love him just as much as the day he was born, but I didn't have to be trapped in what he was,
the ups and downs.
Yeah, in his ups and downs, or in the tragedy that was there. But I could stand by and be supportive when I needed to be, but not, you know, enabling.
Yeah.
And so it gave me that strength to set boundaries, but also, you know, to be loving at the same time.
Yeah.
And so that God's really walked me through that whole process, and I still, to this day, I still trust him, and it's given me the strength to say, hey, you know, you need to have that relationship with God. You need to seek this. You know,
right.
You need to deal with whatever it is, because, you know, there's always something, you know, I believe that there's always something that's inside here. I don't know what the hurt is. You know, I could speculate on what his would be, but I don't know. You know, he's got his own dealings, but he's got to put down, you know, whatever forgiveness or whatever accusations the enemy has, because Satan's always telling people, hey, you know what, you're no good, you can't move forward, you know, whatever,
right.
Or keeping you in unforgiveness. And as soon as people start to do that and forgive, and in situations or people or whatever it is, then the power of that comes off.
And you can't do it for them.
No, and you can't do it for them. You know, that's between them and God. But you can pray for them. You know, I believe that. I believe in intercession and praying for them.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing. We live in this world that's fallen and broken and seemingly worse by the day. And one of my previous guests, we were talking about that scripture, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. And we're kind of living in both halves of that at the same time. We have victory, ultimately. We know the end of the story. We can see great things. We can see fruit. And sometimes we won't see it. I mean, I even think about in Hebrews and the saints, and a lot of them didn't see the end, but they lived it at the time. You know, and I feel like, you know, we're in this world where we have trouble. We want to have peace and joy and life, and yet we may have a kid who never gets over the addiction, or a friend who never forgives, and it's a broken relationship and it never comes back. But how do we live, and I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but how do we live in that, in both places where we are overcoming, we're tapping into the power of God, while living in a broken world where sometimes the things we want to have happen don't happen?
Well, I think the more we tap into the kingdom, because God says the kingdom is at hand, right? So the more we tap into the kingdom, the things of the world, we don't fall into that trap. So if we do have a friend that's, you know, that's stuck in their own stuff, we can still love on them. We can still love on them as much, but we don't become part of that problem or that dynamic, you know, of the world. You know, if we have a child that's still struggling with a drug addiction, we still love on them. We still we still pray for them. We still do all the things, even more. I mean, I found that my love for my son has gotten even stronger because of God, because of what's inside.
It's flowing through you.
Yeah, it is. And I understand God's forgiveness for me and his desire for me, right? Because I see that in my son. I'm just like, I don't care what's happened for the last 15 years. I just want you to be good today. I want things for, you know what I mean? And that's what God wants for us, right?
Yeah.
You know, and
that's the prodigal.
Yeah.
That's the prodigal father.
It is. So I think that, you know, the more we abide in the vine, the more that we're one with Jesus, the more we get to experience the overcoming those trials, you know?
Yeah.
And that's why we get to take heart, because Jesus has overcome the world.
I haven't even got to my questions yet.
Yeah.
But Mike, it's just a fascinating. So let's talk about that. And you mentioned it. Turning over your kids to God is a powerful idea. We're responsible for the kids from when they come out of the womb. We're trying to keep them alive. We're trying to protect them, nurture them, you know, and then they become adults. And I haven't got to this part yet, really, just with my oldest barely. But what's that like? And how would you encourage a parent in terms of your experience with turning your kid, truly spiritually turning your kids over to God?
Well, it was a process in my own faith, right? So, like I said, I prayed for more faith every day, and part of that gift was having the faith, knowing that God was taking care of. I would see Him in my life, and I would see Him in my children's life, you know, and just praying for more faith, more love for God, more faith in God, more trust in God too. That's a prayer, and that's something that I would pray for as well. And God answers those prayers. He allows us to have that trust as well. Mm-hmm. And so it was something that God builds us up day by day. You know, every day that we're here, He's building us up. He's building our spirits up day by day. Mm-hmm. And so He took me from a place that, you know, I was a mess over my son. I had to deal with, you know, some really tough times and some difficult situations. But the more I prayed about it, and the more I went to the Lord about the situation, the more I just, you know, sought my Heavenly Father and wisdom in that matter, then that prayer was answered. If I had stayed and said, I'm going to fix it myself, I got this, I don't need you, God, then it was a mess.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we do as parents, is we go, nah, these are my children, I got them, I don't, you know, and that's, you know, no, God's got our children, He loves our children, you know. Even when I got re-diagnosed, one of the things I was praying to the Lord, I was just like, well, Lord, I need to be here. I've adopted an 8-year-old daughter now, and my wife, and I said, you know, I think I need to be here for them. And God's like, what? You know? And
I got this.
Yeah, and I said, no, you got it, Lord. I know that you have everything. So you know, it's not that I need to. You know. So, but He does, you know, and He's a good God, and He doesn't. Everything that He tells us in the Bible, it's a promise. It's the truth. He is the truth.
Yeah.
And,
I had
and we can rely on that.
Yeah, I had a friend say one time, when he's not doing well or struggling or rattled or unsettled, he would try to find the promise that he wasn't believing. Mm-hmm. I thought that was an interesting thing. Are you in the Word? Do you read the Bible in the morning?
Yeah.
How do you do it?
A lot of times I just ask God, what should I be reading? So sometimes I like to, if I'm studying something, if I'm given a message, you know, then that's always neat for me, because I get to learn, you know, about certain. But if I'm just, you know, picking up the Bible and reading, then, you know, I'll just ask God, you know, what would you like me to read today? And it all depends. I think, you know, I've never once picked up the Bible and not had something apply to me for that season of my life or that day in my life.
Yeah,
you know?
It's alive.
It's alive.
Yeah.
It is alive.
Yeah.
And so I've never once.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite verse? I probably should have prepped you for this.
You know, I have a couple of them. I think Romans 12:21, don't be overcome by evil, overcome evil with good. That's one of my favorite ones. And Proverbs 3:5-8, trust in the Lord with all your heart.
One of mine, I think I've decided on this, is Colossians 1:13, for he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. I think it's a rescue story. And that's, I think, what you've experienced. You've been rescued, haven't you?
Yeah, I've been rescued. Oh, I definitely was rescued. I was in the pit. I was
right. Psalm 103. Yeah. He's delivered us from the pit.
Yeah.
And when you've been rescued, like you have, you really are excited to become a rescuer, in a sense, used by God. You're now working with, you have an organization called At Ease.
Right.
Tell us about the organization and what you're looking to do.
At Ease was something that God put on my heart about 6 years ago, and I just began to pray about just the men and women that I had been working with for so many years, and just the way that post-traumatic stress injuries affect that profession, and how there was really no way to address that. And the more I prayed about it, and the more I thought about it, you know, first responders could only get help if they told their boss, if they went to an employee assistance program. And so you would have to say, hey boss, you know, taking that dead child out of the mother's arms yesterday really bothered me. And they'd say, well, that's nice. Why don't you give me your badge and your gun, and maybe we'll give you your job back, and maybe we'll let you come back to duty. And so there was always that risk of losing your job, being put on administrative leave. There was always the fear that, you know, the stigma of you can't handle this, you know, it's just all these things that had kind of come up, you know, that I had experienced, the things that kept me from wanting to get help at times. And so we came up with a program that is through the Police Foundation. And what we do now is we have a confidential helpline that's not through the city or the county. It's manned by the Counseling Team International, who vets out first responder therapists. They're trained up in trauma and first responder needs and things. And you can just call that number and they'll get you hooked up with somebody to talk to. And there's no paper trail, there's nothing. And the Police Foundation through the community, so we raise money through the community. It's a great formula, it's a perfect formula. So the community raises the funds, and we offer this program up, and the first responder can make the phone call, they get a therapist, and free of charge they can see somebody for as long as they need, and their family too, their family unit as well.
Wow.
So it started off with the police department, it became trusted, and people began to just love the program. The fire department wanted in, so our motto was to say, sure, we'll help. We started to help them. The Firefighters Alliance came on board. A month before the Montecito debris flow happened here, before the Thomas fire, I came over here and offered the program up to Montecito Fire Department.
Wow.
And they usually, an agency that's been through something like this disaster affected this community, they would lose at least 10% of their workforce, and they've lost nobody because of the At Ease program. And you know, so they can reach out. It's really easy to do, and they're able to get the help. And people, you know, it's just an amazing program. So it's growing. We serve from Ventura County now up to San Luis Obispo County. The rest of the nation is looking at our program now.
Wow.
Because it's just that cutting edge. And it came out of prayer. You know, I just started to pray about it, and God just started bringing all the right people and the right counselors, and He's blessing it, and
wow.
It's an amazing program. So it's got,
that's a nonprofit foundation. I mean, it's
a nonprofit. You know, so we offer secular counseling. So there's secular counseling. We also have spiritual care. You know, I do have a prayer ministry that helps with that too. But,
wow. So people can find At Ease Foundation online. Is there a website?
Yeah, there's a website for At Ease.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we'd encourage you support that. That sounds like a wonderful opportunity. Thank you for telling your story. Thank you for the book. Again, I encourage people to get the book. It's A Higher Call to Duty by Sergeant Mike McGrew. But your story is incredible. I'm thankful for you. I'm glad to be your new friend, and thanks for sharing this with viewers. I think this will have a ministry, among groups of people that might be struggling or suffering with one of the things we've talked about. So I think it's hopeful.
Yeah.
Thank you, man.
All right. Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. This is The Good Life, and we'll see you next time.